Welcome to the Discover Jesus podcast. This is a series developed to respond to some of the biggest questions that we hear on university campuses about Jesus.
I'm Lauren. I'm a student intern in Belfast, which I like to say means I have no responsibility and all of the fun.
And I'm Sean, and I'm also a student worker with Agapé. I'm based in Essex. I guess I'm probably the one that has the responsibility, sadly.
Yeah, we both work for Agapé Students, which is an international Christian charity that works with students to... Sean, what do we do?
I guess we discover Jesus together. Lauren and I, we're on a journey discovering more about Jesus ourselves, and we love to help and encourage others to discover Jesus for themselves too.
So today, Agapé have tripped down to OCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, because we've come to ask the experts these questions. We want to know and find out all of the intelligent answers to these questions because we don't have them.
Max and Ben, can you introduce yourselves to us, please?
Sure. So I'm Max Baker-Hyche. I'm a speaker affiliated with OCA, but I also have another hat, which is that I'm a lecturer in philosophy at Wycliffe Hall, Oxford University. Before that, I did a PhD in philosophy at Oxford University, and then before that, I did undergraduate and master's degrees in philosophy and theology at Exeter University. So I've kind of, in my academic work, I've specialised in epistemology, which is sort of questions about the nature of evidence, rationality, knowledge, and how these concepts relate to each other, and also applying that field to questions about religious belief, arguments for and against the existence of God. But I'm also super interested in the epistemology of history and kind of how we can know about history and especially the historical figure of Jesus. So yeah, really great to be with you guys.
Thanks, Max. What about you, Ben?
Hi,
Who are you?
Who am I? Good question. So I'm Ben Thomas. I'm a speaker and tutor at the OCA, Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, and I am also a medical doctor. I've been a doctor for just under 20 years now. And I became a Christian 12 years ago, and in the process of doing that, I really wanted to look at a lot of the truth claims of Jesus and the Bible. So this is a really special topic for me. So I've done a lot of reading over it over the years to look at the truth of what we read in the Bible. So it's good to be here.
Great. Sounds like we're in for a real treat. Mm-hmm. Okay, so to introduce our topic for today, so we're going to be thinking about, was Jesus real? So we have a question for you guys to segue in and to help us to get to know a little bit more about you. So the question is, what is the biggest piece of evidence that you guys walked the earth? So perhaps your descendants in the future, what evidence will they be able to discover to prove your existence?
That's a good one.
Sean was really proud of this question.
Yeah.
Well, I think that so it depends a lot on what our descendants decide to preserve. And the thing is that's interesting about the time we're living in compared to sort of ancient history is there's just an overabundance of stuff that we leave behind to the point where, you know, are my descendants really going to want to preserve my iCloud drive with all my photos? I don't know. I suppose, yeah, probably it's going to be something digital, isn't it? Okay, if I had to hazard a guess, I would probably say it's the sort of academic papers that I've published because they're sort of in the public domain, whereas my photos and videos, who knows whether anyone will bother to keep them. Now, whether anyone will bother to read my academic papers more than the 5 people who already have read them, I have no idea. But they will somewhere exist in you know, cyberspace. Yeah, I guess that's probably my best bet of being remembered in the future.
Okay, brilliant. How about you, Ben?
One of my life highlights was at the age of 8 being on a children's TV programme with the celebrity Carol Vorderman. And I decided that I didn't know how telephones worked and that I needed to know, as a matter of urgency, how telephones worked. So I wrote into this children's programme because she was doing like a science thing on this thing. It's called the Wide Awake Club. And I got invited on to be on and to ask her how telephones worked, which in many ways was a massive cringe looking back at it now. But actually, that's what I did, and that was televised. So I think I will actually be somewhere on kind of national television recording.
You've been immortalised in film.
Yeah.
Actually, I have to say, I'm slightly disappointed that neither of you said this podcast.
Yeah.
But
I was coming on to that, and then other, highlights in terms of this podcast.
So, as you said, our topic for the day was Jesus real? So I guess I'll just give you a big open-ended question. How can we be sure that Jesus actually existed? What evidence do we have?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think I would want to preface this by saying I think there's a sort of big information gap between scholarship, academics in universities who specialise in ancient history and what they think about this, and the public. So as you guys know, surveys are showing that quite high percentages of the general public think that Jesus didn't really exist. And, I want to say that I can understand why that is. If you do a Google search, you get something like 80 million results if you type in, was Jesus real or did Jesus exist? And some of the top sites that come up are sort of skeptics sites that make it sound like it's a really open question whether Jesus existed. But it's not in terms of the academy, in terms of professional ancient historians. So I think just to illustrate this, a friend of mine, John Dixon, who's an ancient historian, also sort of does public theology, he put out a sort of challenge in the Australian media in 2014 where he said if someone can come forward with the name of a real professor who is in the fields of either ancient history, classics, or New Testament studies, holds a position at some university anywhere in the world, and who thinks that Jesus didn't exist, then John would go on live TV and eat a page of the Bible. Anyway, it's sort of funny kind of challenge to put out there, but so that's what, over 8 years ago now. And no one has been able to identify a scholar in any of those fields who thinks Jesus didn't exist, so I think let's of course get into why is that. But I think it is important to start off with that thought that actually it might seem on one level to be an open question if you kind of talk to the average person in the street. But if you talk to people in the departments of ancient history, if we go down the road in Oxford, it's considered to be beyond reasonable doubt that Jesus existed.
Wow, so it sounds like we could maybe just leave the podcast there, but also it might be good to actually go through, like you said already, to go through some of the evidence. So what is the evidence that we have to Jesus' existence?
Well, I would put it in terms of three things really. So whenever historians look at an ancient document, to sort of get a sense of how reliable it is and how likely to be true are the claims that it makes. They're thinking especially about the earliness, how close in time was it to the events, and of course how close was the person who wrote it to the events, but also multiplicity. Are there other sources that corroborate at least the general gist? And another thing is the variety of types of sources. So we have all of those three things in abundance when it comes to Jesus. But I think before we get into that, I think it's important to really stress this point. So only about 1% of the documentation from the first century has survived to this day. And there's a heavy bias towards the records of very prominent political and military figures. So we have a decent amount of evidence concerning the Caesars, the Roman emperors, and King Herod the Great, who built lots of big palaces and so on in Israel, Palestine. So there's some literary evidence about him. But what's quite striking is Jesus was none of those things. He wasn't a military leader. He wasn't a political leader. He was just a craftsman from this sort of little backwater in the Roman Empire. But actually, he's attested in many more written sources than Herod the Great, who was the greatest kind of Jewish king of his day. I mean, with Jesus, most scholars would say the earliest sources are that we have that talk about Jesus are the letters of the Apostle Paul. Now, yes, the Apostle Paul was a follower of Jesus, although not during Jesus' earthly ministry. Paul, converted famously with this experience on the Damascus Road, having been a persecutor. But Paul, even the most skeptical of historians who would want to chip away at lots of different bits of the Gospels, would accept that there really was this guy called Paul who converted to be a Jesus follower, and who wrote at least 7 letters that were definitely, all scholars would agree, 7 letters that are attributed to Paul were really by this guy. And they would all agree that Paul is sincere when he says that he visited Jerusalem several times and met with the brothers of Jesus, and that he talked to eyewitnesses who claimed that they saw Jesus alive after his death, whatever one makes of those claims. But certainly that the sincerity is not in doubt. And so this is really important because Paul was writing within, just a couple of decades of Jesus' crucifixion. And when you compare that with, say, the Emperor Tiberius, the earliest written source we have about him is 77 years after his death. And that's not considered a huge time gap in terms of ancient history. So the letters of Paul are really an enormous kind of bedrock, which is very difficult for anyone to get around if they're trying to deny the existence of Jesus, because Paul attests numerous kind of important facts that make clear that Paul knew living relatives and friends of Jesus, and that Paul knows various things about him, knows about the way in which he died and so on. And so that's one thing, the earliness, and then of course the Gospels, which were written within maybe 3, 4, 5 decades of the events, which I know sounds a long time in our terms, but actually, again, in ancient history terms, that wasn't a big gap. And it was during the time at which eyewitnesses were still alive. But then we've also got, and it's important to mention this, a number of sources which are not written by followers of Jesus at all. So Josephus was a Jewish aristocrat who was writing towards the end of the 1st century, and he has a big work called The Antiquities of the Jewish People, and it has 2 references to Jesus. One of them is a bit complicated because scholars agree it has been sort of touched up over the years by Christian scribes. Most scholars do think you can get back to an original core that did talk about Jesus. But the other reference is not really in doubt at all, and that talks about how the brother of Jesus, James, was executed. Anyway, so what Josephus says about Jesus is quite minimal, but it completely fits with what the New Testament says. So Josephus says that he was a teacher, he was loved by lots of people, seen as a wise man, had this reputation for doing miracles, and that he was executed by crucifixion. Then we've also got a Roman historian called Tacitus, who was a senator, who wrote a history of imperial Rome in the early 2nd century. And he refers to him as Chrestus. But he knows that Jesus was the founder of this movement, which blossomed and spread as far as Rome, and he knows that Jesus was crucified under the authority of Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea. And so you've got this kind of variety of types of sources. You've got both people who followed him. And I think it's important to say as well, Paul is a bit different from Jesus' other followers because he didn't start out following Jesus. He started out hostile too. But then you've got these non-Christian sources who they don't like the Christian movement, but they're writing about how Jesus founded this movement and did various things that match with what the New Testament says.
why are there 4 different accounts of Jesus' life in the Bible? Like, why do we need 4 different sources? Like, what is important about each source?
Yeah, so that was very much something that I looked at when I was in the process of becoming a Christian, and a lot of the questions that are often raised are like, are there contradictions between the accounts, and why are there some differences written? Why are some things included in all 4 accounts of Jesus' life, and others where there's only mentioned in one of the Gospels? And to me, I mean, particularly as a doctor, when you're trying to look at, you haven't got the whole picture, but you're trying to piece together what's happened, it's actually very helpful to have multiple people speak into an event from their perspective. And when you do that, you will expect there to be some differences, because of course people have different perspectives. They've come into the event at different times, they were in different places, they didn't all see it, but actually they did see bits of it, and then you can kind of piece together the puzzle from there. And that, for me, and I think a lot of scholars who've done this, actually makes it more credible, the fact that you've got multiple people all talking about roughly the same thing, even to the level that there are some differences between the Gospels. And for example, there are different emphases. For example, at the empty tomb, when Jesus had risen, as what we believe that he had risen, that there are different accounts as to who was actually at the tomb. But those, when you look at them, aren't actually contradictory. They're just different accounts of which people were at the tomb itself. And so you're particularly looking at the women who'd arrived. When you look at the different Gospels, there are different accounts of that, but that actually makes it more credible. I'm inherently cynical and a disbelieving person. You kind of think, well, actually, if the story was exactly the same 4 times over, that would lead me to think, hang on, has this actually been made up and kind of fabricated in a way? But the fact that there are actual differences that you can very likely explain due to the different perspectives of people and the times that they were there, then that makes it a lot more credible. And also, there's just the natural thing that Jesus did a lot of things. He had a very busy time of ministry, and people were in those times for different parts. There, you've got Luke, who was not strictly speaking an eyewitness to the things of Jesus, but wanted to document them down and had spoken with a lot of people who were eyewitnesses. And then you've got John, for example, who was one of the apostles, so very close to Jesus. So you've got a number of different people writing those things down. I think it's also very, very transparent about the fact that it's likely that some of the material from the Gospels was shared between the people who wrote those Gospels. And again, if you're wanting to preserve the accuracy of an event, it would seem very reasonable to kind of say, okay, well, hang on, what did you see? What did you see? What did you see? And so you can actually make sure that you're talking about the same thing, and that you're accurately recording exactly what happened.
Why should we trust the Bible? Because I guess when you look at it, it's a Christian source, and it can be easy to assume that because it's a Christian source, it's biased in some way. So I guess I'm just curious. And what about like other non-Christian sources or sources that aren't from followers of Jesus?
Do you want to?
Yeah, so I think going back to what Max said earlier, you've got I've found the story and the account of Paul initially Saul very persuasive, because actually he was a hater of Christians and spent certainly in the first part of the book of Acts that was also written by Luke. There's a lot of good evidence to suggest that he was a big persecutor of Christians. So there would have been no reason for him to have made anything up in that way. And then there was a conversion experience whereby he then changed his tune as a result of that experience that he'd had. And so you've got people in there who are very, sort of actually in the Bible itself, who were very sceptical and actually greatly disliked the person of Jesus and Christianity as a whole, who then became dissuaded from it. The other thing that I found persuasive was that a lot of the people, the early Jesus followers, suffered a lot for their beliefs, and actually many of them died in that process of essentially saying, look, we believe that this is true. And although you can't ever completely guarantee it, it seems highly unusual to die for something that you actually know to be untrue. It may be that you are deluded, but actually it's very unusual to actually die for something that you think is untrue. So, because we generally have that kind of joie de vivre and desire to kind of keep alive is a kind of a basic human instinct. So, I think those things together are quite persuasive, and also the fact, again, going back to what Max said earlier, that you have a number of people outside of the Bible who have also vouched for the things that happened. Now, they may not have believed that Jesus was the Son of God, they may not have liked Christianity, but they were certainly able to vouch for the fact as they saw it, and actually a lot of the extra biblical sources that we had would sort of testify to various bits in Jesus' account, his death and his resurrection, and then the story of the early church becoming, in their view, quite problematic. And so we've got a lot of things that written by people that you wouldn't necessarily expect to want to tell the truth in this regard.
I think one question that I have, and one thing that I'm curious about for both of you, but Ben, you kind of touched already on how the evidence for Jesus and his existence and his credibility. I guess my question is, what is one thing, or what are some things that have convinced you that Jesus is real? I know you talked about Paul's writings and things, but maybe tell us a bit more about your story and why this was so important to you.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's the fact that with my kind of scientific background or whatever, but I've always been interested in what is the truth. Like, I don't want to believe anything because it sounds nice. I want to actually believe it because I think it's got a really good chance of being true. And so from that point of view, I really appreciate the fact that we have modern scholars now who are Christian and non-Christian, who would testify to the fact that Jesus was real. We also had people, the early writings, as we've said, also written by people maybe with the motivation to say that Jesus is real, but also not with the motivation to say that Jesus was real, testifying to that. And also, I think that the most persuasive thing for me is the documentation of the eyewitness testimony that was done so close to the time when Jesus was around. That I think is really quite a privilege from what I understand, Max, compared to most other ancient literature, which is written many more years, in fact, at a distance from the events that happened. So it is actually quite an exquisite privilege to have that stuff that is so close, because it means that the chances of myth developing is so much less. And that, I guess, alludes to what Max was saying about the other, the sort of what's maybe known as the more Gnostic gospel sort of thing, that where there's potentially some myth coming in there. And so, the early documentation, the multiple attestation, and people who wouldn't necessarily have a bias to write about Jesus actually writing that anyway. I think those three things were the most persuasive thing for me.
Thanks very much, Ben. That's really helpful to hear how you have been impacted by this. But I guess one question to wrap us up would be, why do you think it matters that Jesus existed?
Well, I think the reason it matters is because Jesus made claims about himself, and his early followers made claims about himself that, if they are true, do change everything. So, Jesus' earliest followers claim in very surprising terms, given that these are devout monotheistic Jews who believe in one God. They there's really very good historical evidence that the belief that Jesus was God incarnate goes back to the earliest days of the Christian movement after Jesus' death and what they believed was his resurrection. So it can't be notched up to a sort of, some kind of developing idea that escalates over time. It is really a very surprising phenomenon that these monotheistic Jews believed that God had come in the form of a man. And so, if this is the case, if that's true, then it means that God has actually stepped into human history and has experienced all the messiness and brokenness of this world in the flesh, in the first person. For me, that when I was sort of looking into Christianity and trying to figure out whether I thought it was true at the age of 19, a thought did strike me one day, which was that, given that human life is hard, it has its joys, but I think no one is immune from suffering, and this world can be a really rough place. And actually, it struck me that I don't think I could believe in God unless that God had actually experienced what it's like to be a human being in the first person. So for me, I think that's why it matters whether Jesus existed.
I think C.S. Lewis said something really helpful that is quite well known for those who obsess over his writings, but he gave the trilemma effectively that Jesus was either a liar, a lunatic, or he was Lord. So the stuff that was actually said, that he said in the Gospels, if that is to be believed, and as you've heard, we think that it is credible testimony, then he wasn't just a good person or quite a nice bloke who was a carpenter kind of thing. He didn't leave that open. He was either completely deluded or he was making it up and was a deeply unpleasant and sinister individual, or he was actually God. And each person who reads the biographies of Jesus is encouraged to make the decision for themselves. And that is what I'd encourage anyone who's watching or listening to this podcast to make that decision for themselves as well on those three. I think personally there's ample evidence there from the later writings of Paul and the other books of the New Testament, and also the completion of what Jesus has done from the Old Testament as well. I think there's more than enough evidence for me to make that clear. But that is the challenge that C.S. Lewis gives to anyone who reads the accounts of Jesus.
That's brilliant. Max and Ben, thank you so much for your time today. It's been fascinating. Laura and I have learnt an awful lot, and I'm sure our listeners have as well. It's just a shame we don't have more time. So if we want to dig a bit more into some of these things, do you have some recommendations for us about where we should go to do that?
Yeah, so let me recommend 2 books and 1 website. So the 2 books are, John Dickson, who, as I mentioned, is an ancient historian. He's got a book called Is Jesus History? And then Peter J. Williams, so he's a scholar of New Testament studies based at Cambridge University, and he has a book called Can We Trust the Gospels? So those are 2 really accessible but books written by proper credentialed scholars, really full of helpful insights. And then 1 website which really kind of summarizes the evidence for the existence of Jesus. So beliefmap.org /Jesus/exist #historians. I'll say that one more time. So it's beliefmap.org /Jesus/exist #historians. So that's a really useful resource, very succinct summary of some of the key evidence for the existence of Jesus.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Discover Jesus podcast. Don't forget that this is part of a series of episodes answering questions that students have about Jesus. So you can find more information about that at www.agapé.org.uk/discoverpodcast. There will be all the information about the speakers that we've had on the different episodes with their bios, their recommendations for further information, as well as some recommendations that we have. There'll also be information on there about conversation groups that you can be a part of and see if there's one happening in your area to discuss more about discovering Jesus and these big questions. But I think that's everything, and bye for now.